Before the first stonemason laid a single block, before the first watchtower was conceived, the story of San Marino began with the mountain itself. Monte Titano is a geological anomaly, a mass of limestone thrust upward from the earth millions of years before the rise of Rome. It is a clip, a remnant of the Apennine mountain range that, through immense tectonic pressures during the Miocene epoch, slid eastward over softer clay deposits. This geological journey left it isolated, a solitary limestone outcrop standing 739 meters above the surrounding lowlands. Its composition is the fossilized memory of an ancient sea, made almost entirely of the calcified remains of corals and marine organisms that thrived in the warm waters of the Tethys Ocean. This organic origin gives the rock a particular strength and character, a foundation built not from volcanic fire, but from life itself. The mountain's strategic importance is a direct consequence of this geological history. Its three distinct peaks offered natural platforms for observation and defense, while its sheer, near-vertical cliffs on several sides rendered it a formidable natural fortress. From its summit, the view is commanding and absolute, a panoramic sweep that encompasses the Morecchia River Valley to the south and the coastal plains leading to the Adriatic Sea. Any army moving through the region, any merchant caravan on the ancient roads, would be visible for miles. This inherent defensibility made Monte Titano a place of inherent security in a landscape that otherwise offered few natural strongholds. It did not require the hand of man to become a fortress. It was born as one. This strategic value was not theoretical. Just a quick announcement. If you enjoy this video so far, please subscribe to our channel, as it motivates us to bring you a new story every evening. This is the only kind request tonight, and we won't bother you with it anymore until the very end of today's story. Let's get back to the video. The mountain provided control over critical lines of communication between the Italian interior and the coast. It was a watchtower from which one could anticipate danger long before it arrived, a quality that would prove invaluable in the centuries of chaos to come. The isolation that defined its geology also defined its destiny. It was near the centers of power, like the Roman city of Ariminum, yet distinctly separate from them. This proximity to civilization, combined with its extreme defensibility, created the perfect conditions for a sanctuary. It was a place one could retreat to, a bastion that could be held by a determined few against a far greater force. The mountain was a physical declaration of separateness, a limestone rampart against the tides of history that would sweep across the Italian peninsula. Its very existence was a promise of refuge, a silent invitation to those seeking a place where they might endure. The geology of the mountain was the first chapter of the Republic's constitution, its strategic position the first article of its long-held liberty. In the late 3rd century, the Italian peninsula was the heart of a Roman Empire, recovering from a period of profound trauma. The preceding 5 decades, known as the crisis of the 3rd century, had seen the imperial system pushed to the brink of collapse by incessant civil wars, barbarian invasions, and economic devastation. The province of Emilia, where Monte Titano stood, was a microcosm of the empire's state. It was a historically prosperous region, bisected by the vital Via Emilia road, with its administrative and commercial life centered on coastal cities like Ariminum. Yet, it bore the scars of the crisis. Its agricultural output was strained by decades of instability and the constant requisitioning of supplies for armies that seemed to march endlessly to quell one usurpation after another. This was the world that Emperor Diocletian inherited in 284 AD. A brilliant soldier and administrator of humble Illyrian origins, he recognized that the old imperial system was no longer viable. His solution was not a restoration, but a radical reinvention of the state. To solve the problem of unwieldy borders and succession crises, he instituted the Tetrarchy, a system of rule by 4. The empire was formally divided into eastern and western halves, each governed by a senior emperor, an Augustus, and a junior emperor, a Caesar. This structure was designed to provide localized leadership for pressing military threats and to create a clear, stable line of succession. Diocletian ruled as the senior Augustus in the east, fundamentally shifting the empire's center of gravity away from Rome. His reforms permeated every level of society. He restructured the provinces, breaking large territories into smaller, more manageable units grouped into new administrative districts called dioceses. The military was expanded and reorganized, with a clear distinction made between mobile field armies, comitatenses, and frontier garrisons, limitanae. To fund this massive state apparatus, Diocletian implemented a comprehensive tax reform based on a census of population and land, the capitatio iugatio. This system, while creating a more predictable revenue stream for the state, placed an immense and often crushing burden on the populace. The nature of emperorship itself was transformed. The old fiction of the emperor as princeps, or first citizen, was abandoned. Diocletian adopted the title of dominus, or lord, and instituted an elaborate court ceremonial borrowed from the Persian Empire, requiring subjects to perform proskynesis, or full prostration, in his presence. This was an empire of command and control, a rigid, autocratic state forged to ensure its own survival after a century of chaos. It was a society demanding absolute loyalty, where the needs of the state superseded all individual concerns, creating the oppressive political climate from which a stonemason might soon need to flee. Diocletian's demand for absolute loyalty within his restructured state inevitably collided with the Christian faith, an organized religion whose adherents pledged ultimate allegiance to authority higher than the emperor. For nearly 2 decades, Diocletian had tolerated Christianity, but in 303 AD, influenced by his junior Caesar, Galerius, and a desire to enforce complete religious uniformity, he unleashed the most systematic and severe persecution in the empire's history. This was not a spontaneous pogrom, but a calculated state policy enacted through a series of imperial edicts designed to dismantle the Christian Church and eradicate its influence. The first edict, issued from Nicomedia on February 23, 303, was a targeted strike against the infrastructure and legal standing of the Christian community. It commanded the destruction of all churches, the burning of sacred scriptures, and the confiscation of all property belonging to the church. Furthermore, it stripped Christians of noble birth of their rank and legal privileges, making them vulnerable to judicial torture, and declared that Christian freedmen in the imperial household were to be re-enslaved. This initial decree was followed by a second, which ordered the arrest and imprisonment of the entire Christian clergy, from bishops to deacons. The intent was to decapitate the church, leaving its congregations without leadership or spiritual guidance. A third edict later that year offered an amnesty. Imprisoned clerics who agreed to perform a token sacrifice to the Roman gods would be released. This was a psychological tool designed to break the will of the church's leaders and create schisms within the community. The final and most draconian edict was promulgated in 304 AD, extending the obligation to sacrifice to the entire population. Every man, woman, and child in the empire was required to make a public offering to the traditional gods on pain of death. This transformed Christianity from a proscribed religion into a capital offense for any who refused to comply. The enforcement of these edicts varied in intensity across the Tetrarchy. In the West, under Constantius, the father of Constantine the Great, the persecution was relatively mild, largely limited to the destruction of church buildings. However, in the East, under Diocletian and Galerius, and in Italy and Africa, under Maximian, the laws were pursued with ruthless efficiency. The atmosphere in cities like Ariminum became one of pervasive fear. Christians were driven from public life, their social networks shattered, neighbours were encouraged to inform on one another, and local magistrates were under immense pressure to meet quotas of recantations or executions. For a Christian, especially a skilled artisan or community figure known to the authorities, remaining in a populated urban centre was to live under a constant threat of arrest, torture, and death. This climate of terror was the direct catalyst that drove thousands to abandon their homes and livelihoods seeking safety in the most remote and inaccessible corners of the empire. The traditional founder of the Republic, Marinus, was a product of the Roman Empire's eastern frontier. Hagiographic sources place his origin on the island of Arb, known today as Rab, off the coast of the Roman province of Dalmatia in modern Croatia. This region was a well-integrated part of the empire, known for its hardy seafarers and, crucially, its high-quality limestone quarries. Marinus was a Lapicidina, a skilled stonemason, a trade that was both respected and in high demand for the constant construction and repair projects that sustained the empire's infrastructure. Historical context suggests that he, along with a companion named Leo, who would later found the nearby community of San Leo, was part of a mobile artisan class that travelled throughout the empire to where work was available. Their Christian faith was central to their identity, likely adopted in a region where the religion had spread quietly but firmly among the working classes. Their journey across the Adriatic Sea to the port of Ariminum was not an act of flight, but one of economic migration. They were drawn by a specific, large-scale public works project, the reconstruction and fortification of the port of Ariminum. This city, modern Rimini, was a strategic hub on the Italian coast, the terminus of the Via Flaminia from Rome. Its harbour and city walls were vital military and commercial assets. The decision to reinforce them reflects the broader imperial strategy under Diocletian of shoring up key infrastructure in the face of persistent external threats. Marinus and Leo arrived around the year 301 AD, bringing with them the specialized skills needed for such a project. As Christian artisans, they would have entered a community that was already established but increasingly wary. Their arrival predated the most severe edicts of the Great Persecution, but the political climate was already turning hostile. They came not as missionaries but as labourers, intending to earn a living while practicing their faith within the existing Christian network of Ariminum. The historical Marinus was therefore not initially a hermit or a refugee, but a skilled tradesman participating in the Roman economy. His deep piety, however, meant that he was more than just a worker. He was a member of a community defined by a shared belief system that was on a direct collision course with the totalitarian demands of the Diocletianic state. His presence in Ariminum was a confluence of the mundane and the profound, an ordinary Roman artisan whose extraordinary faith would soon be tested by one of history's most organized campaigns of religious suppression. Upon arriving in Ariminum, Marinus and Leo would have been integrated into the city's labor force, working in the quarries that supplied the stone for the port's reconstruction. Life for such artisans was physically demanding, governed by the rhythms of the worksite and the oversight of Roman engineers. As a Lapicidina, Marinus's daily existence revolved around the quarrying, cutting, and dressing of stone, a physically arduous task that required both immense strength and precise skill. He would have been part of a larger, organized workforce, likely housed in barracks or simple lodgings near the construction zone. Within this environment, he and Leo found a pre-existing Christian community. This was not a public, proselytizing body, but a discreet network of believers who met for worship in private homes, or domus ecclesiae, to avoid attracting official notice. The church in Ariminum, like in many Roman cities, was a close-knit society within a society, providing mutual support, spiritual guidance, and a shared identity in a world that was becoming increasingly hostile. For the first couple of years, this arrangement was tenable. Marinus could earn a living and practice his faith with a degree of anonymity. However, the promulgation of Diocletian's first edict in 303 AD shattered this precarious balance. The order to destroy churches and burn scriptures would have been carried out with zeal by local magistrates in a strategic city like Ariminum. The Christian community was forced deeper underground, its places of worship dismantled, and its sacred texts turned to ash. The subsequent edicts intensified the pressure exponentially. The arrest of the clergy would have deprived the local church of its leadership, creating confusion and fear among the laity. The final edict of 304 AD, mandating universal sacrifice, made every Christian a potential criminal. For Marinus, a known figure in the artisan community, the danger was acute. Public works projects were under direct state supervision, and the authorities would have systematically tested the loyalty of the workforce. Refusal to perform the sacrifice was not a private matter of conscience, but a public act of defiance against the emperor's will, tantamount to treason. Historical records from this period are filled with accounts of officials setting up altars at work sites, in marketplaces, and at city gates, forcing individuals to choose between their faith and their life. For a devout Christian like Marinus, the choice was clear, but it rendered his continued presence in the city impossible. He was no longer just a stonemason. He was a fugitive from a state that demanded total ideological submission. Faced with the state-enforced ultimatum of apostasy or execution, Marinus's flight from Ariminum was a calculated act of self-preservation. As a known Christian within a state-supervised workforce, his options were limited to martyrdom or escape. He chose the latter, a decision facilitated by his intimate knowledge of the local terrain gained from years of working in the region's quarries. His selection of Monte Titano, visible from the coastal plain, was not random but a strategic choice. The mountain was known to be rugged, sparsely populated, and difficult to access, making it an ideal location to evade the reach of Roman authorities, whose control was strongest in urban centers and along major roadways. It was close enough to be reached in a day's journey, yet its topography offered a world of separation from the organized society of the plain. The physical act of ascending the mountain would have been a formidable challenge. Marinus would have navigated the lower slopes, likely following animal trails or the paths of shepherds, before beginning the steep climb up the limestone cliffs. As a stonemason, his physical conditioning and familiarity with rock formations would have been significant assets, allowing him to identify viable routes and negotiate treacherous terrain that would deter a typical fugitive. He was not simply running, he was applying his professional skills to the problem of survival. The goal was not merely to hide, but to establish a defensible and sustainable refuge far from the jurisdiction of the magistrates of Ariminum. Upon reaching the summit, his first priority would have been to establish a hermitage. This was not an act of mystical retreat, but a practical necessity. He would have sought out a natural cave or rock shelter, a common feature in the mountain's karstic limestone, and improved upon it using his masonry skills to create a secure and weatherproof dwelling. This initial settlement was solitary and functional, designed to provide the basic requirements for survival: shelter from the elements, a defensible position, and access to a water source. The establishment of this hermitage marked the transition of Marinus from a fugitive artisan to the founder of a nascent community. It was the first permanent human habitation on the peak, a small act of defiance that laid the physical groundwork for an independent society. His purpose was not to found a state, but to create a space where he could practice his faith without persecution, a simple hermitage that, through historical circumstance, would become the nucleus of the world's oldest republic. Marinus's hermitage on Monte Titano did not remain solitary for long. News of a secure refuge, particularly one established by a figure known for his piety, would have spread discreetly through the clandestine Christian networks of the region. The initial gathering on the mountain was not an organized colonization, but a slow, organic accretion of individuals and families, also fleeing the Diocletianic persecution. These were not colonists seeking new lands, but refugees seeking survival. They were drawn to the mountain by two primary factors: the physical security it offered and the spiritual anchor provided by Marinus. His presence transformed the peak from a mere hiding place into a locus of Christian community. The first society on Monte Titano was therefore composed of disparate people, artisans, farmers, and laborers, united by a common faith and a common threat. The initial structure of this community was necessarily egalitarian and acephalous. There was no formal government or established leader in the political sense. Authority was derived from piety and practical skill, with Marinus serving as a spiritual guide and moral arbiter rather than a chieftain or magistrate. Decisions were likely made collectively, based on consensus and the immediate needs of the group. The organizing principle was mutual protection and the pooling of resources. Labor was communal, with tasks assigned based on ability. Some would work to expand the natural caves into more permanent dwellings, others would clear small terraces for subsistence agriculture, and still others would stand watch, guarding the few accessible paths to the summit. This was a society forged in adversity, where survival depended on absolute cooperation. Their shared Christian faith was the essential social adhesive that bound this fledgling community together. It provided a common moral framework, a shared worldview, and the rituals that structured their daily and weekly lives. In the absence of formal laws, the tenets of their religion, charity, mutual support, and forgiveness functioned as a de facto constitution. This religious cohesion was critical, as it prevented the internal fragmentation that might otherwise have destroyed such a diverse group of people living under extreme pressure. The community on Monte Titano was, in its earliest form, a church in the wilderness, a congregation whose shared belief was the foundation of their social and political existence. It was this small, self-selecting group of refugees, bound by a commitment to both their faith and their collective security, that formed the true historical nucleus of the future republic. The community's transition from a group of tolerated squatters to legitimate landowners is explained by a foundational tradition that, while legendary, was crucial for establishing the legal basis of their sovereignty. Hagiographic accounts, compiled centuries later but reflecting older oral histories, state that Monte Titano was the private property of a wealthy Roman noblewoman from Rimini named Felicissima. The presence of this small, unauthorized Christian settlement on her land was an affront to both her property rights and her pagan sensibilities. According to the legend, the situation escalated when her son, who was hunting on the mountain, fell gravely ill after a confrontation with Marinus. Enraged, Felicissima and her husband confronted the hermit, demanding he cure their son or face legal retribution. The narrative then pivots on a miracle. Marinus, through prayer, is said to have healed the noblewoman's son. This act of divine intervention had a profound effect on Felicissima, leading not only to her gratitude, but to her conversion to Christianity. In recognition of this miracle, and as an expression of her newfound faith, she made a formal legal donation of Monte Titano to Marinus and his followers in perpetuity. This part of the legend is the most critical from a historical and legal perspective. While the miracle is a matter of faith, the concept of a legal land grant was a well-understood and essential component of Roman law. By framing their origin in this way, the Samarinese were not merely telling a story of divine favor, they were asserting a legitimate, legally defensible claim to their territory. This foundational myth served a vital purpose. It established that the community's presence on the mountain was not an act of unlawful seizure, but the result of a legitimate transfer of property from a rightful owner. This provided them with a powerful legal argument against any future claims on their land by feudal lords, bishops, or even the papacy. It transformed their status from refugees living on occupied land to a free community residing on property that was legally and indisputably their own. The tradition of Felicissima's gift, therefore, is the cornerstone of San Marino's claim to sovereignty, a narrative that grounds their independence not in conquest or rebellion, but in a lawful and pious act of donation recognized under the prevailing legal system of the time. The final and most defining act of Saint Marinus, as preserved in tradition, was not a miracle but a political testament. On his deathbed, sometime in the mid-4th century, he is said to have gathered the community and bequeathed to them not just the mountain, but a radical principle of governance. The traditional words attributed to him, "Relinquo vos liberos ab utroque homine," which translates to "I leave you free from both men," became the ideological cornerstone of the Republic. This statement, whether a verbatim quote or a later encapsulation of the community's core beliefs, is a profound political declaration. In the context of the late Roman world, both men was understood to mean the two great powers that claimed universal authority, the emperor and the pope. It was a declaration of independence from both secular and ecclesiastical overlordship, an assertion that the community on Monte Titano would be sovereign and self-governing, beholden to no external power. This oral testament established a political philosophy that was unique for its time. While other communities were defined by their allegiance to a king, an emperor, or a bishop, the San Marinese were defined by their freedom from such allegiances. The principle of libertas perpetua, or perpetual liberty, was not merely a desire for autonomy, but a foundational legal and moral doctrine. It posited that their sovereignty was not granted by any earthly power, but was an inherent right, bequeathed by their founder. This concept was crucial for their survival in the coming centuries. When confronted by the claims of feudal lords or the bishops of Rimini, the San Marinese could fall back on this foundational principle, arguing that their independence was a sacred inheritance that predated any subsequent political arrangements. Marinus's final act was to transform a community of faith into a political body with a clear and distinct ideology. He was not creating a state with laws and institutions, but he was providing the essential non-negotiable principle upon which all future laws and institutions would be built. The bequeathal of the mountain was a transfer of collective ownership to the community itself, making every member a co-heir to the land and its attendant liberty. This established a powerful sense of shared identity and purpose, uniting the inhabitants in the common cause of defending their inherited freedom. The legacy of Marinus was therefore twofold. He had provided a physical refuge on the mountain, and, with his final words, he had provided an ideological fortress that would prove even more durable than its stone towers. The ideological fortress bequeathed by Marinus was soon tested by the complete disintegration of the secular power it defied. The 5th century witnessed the systematic collapse of the Western Roman Empire's administrative and military structures in Italy. The sack of Rome by the Visigoths in 410 AD was a profound psychological blow, but the final anticlimactic deposition of the last Western emperor, Romulus Augustulus, by the Germanic chieftain Odoacer in 476 AD marked the formal end of imperial rule. This event did not create a single, unified successor state, but a power vacuum, leaving the Italian peninsula fragmented and vulnerable. The intricate network of Roman roads, aqueducts, and administration fell into disrepair, and political authority devolved to local strongmen and invading groups. For the community on Monte Titano, the collapse of the empire meant the disappearance of the very authority they had originally fled, replacing a single organized threat with a landscape of chaotic, unpredictable dangers. The first wave to fill this vacuum was the Ostrogothic kingdom, established by Theodoric the Great in 493 AD after he defeated Odoacer. The Ostrogoths, while a Germanic ruling class, largely maintained the existing Roman administrative apparatus and tax systems, creating a period of relative stability. However, their Arian Christianity created a religious rift with the native Catholic population. The subsequent Gothic War, 535–554 AD, a devastating conflict initiated by the Eastern Roman Emperor Justinian to reconquer Italy, shattered this stability, leaving the peninsula ravaged and depopulated. The brief Byzantine restoration was followed by a far more disruptive invasion in 568 AD by the Lombards, a Germanic people who swept into a weakened Italy. Unlike the Ostrogoths, the Lombards fractured the peninsula's political unity, establishing a kingdom in the north and various independent duchies in the center and south, leading to centuries of endemic warfare with the remaining Byzantine territories. The survival of the community on Monte Titano through this period of relentless upheaval was a direct consequence of its strategic insignificance. While armies fought for control of major cities like Ravenna and Rimini and the fertile agricultural lands of the Po and Morecchia valleys, a small, impoverished settlement atop a rugged mountain offered no economic or strategic prize. Subjugating it would have required a disproportionate military effort for negligible gain in terms of tribute, land, or manpower. The community's poverty and isolation were its most effective defenses. They were not a threat to be neutralized, nor a resource to be exploited. By remaining outside the political and economic currents of the time, they were simply overlooked, an island of continuity in a sea of violent change, weathering the storm not through active resistance, but by being beneath the notice of the conquerors. Throughout the turbulent early Middle Ages, from the 7th to the 10th centuries, the community on Monte Titano evolved from a simple refuge into a recognized sanctuary. The endemic warfare between the Lombards, the papacy, and the Byzantine Exarchate of Ravenna created a state of perpetual insecurity on the plains. In this environment, the mountain's reputation as a secure, self-governing Christian enclave would have attracted a slow but steady influx of people. This was not a mass migration, but a gradual trickle of individuals and families seeking escape from the constant violence, political instability, and arbitrary rule that characterized the era. These newcomers were not religious fugitives in the same vein as the original founders, but people displaced by war and political chaos, drawn to the one place in the region that offered a degree of peace and stability. This influx led to a slow, organic growth of the population. The community, likely numbering only in the low hundreds, expanded incrementally. The limited agricultural capacity of the mountain itself acted as a natural check on population size, preventing the settlement from growing large enough to attract the unwanted attention of powerful neighbors. This constrained growth was crucial for maintaining the social cohesion and egalitarian ethos of the original community. Archaeological evidence from this period points to a gradual expansion of the settlement on the upper slopes, with the construction of simple stone dwellings and the clearing of additional terraces for cultivation. The society remained small, insular, and focused on subsistence, its growth measured over generations rather than years. With a growing population and a more permanent settlement to protect, the inhabitants began to supplement the mountain's natural defenses with their own rudimentary fortifications. This marked a significant shift from a purely passive survival strategy to one of active, organized defense. The first man-made structures were likely simple, functional walls constructed from local limestone, designed to block the few accessible paths to the summit. On the highest of the three peaks, the site of the future Guaita, a basic watchtower would have been erected. This was not a grand military fortress, but a simple stone lookout post, allowing the community to spot approaching dangers from even greater distances. These early fortifications were a physical manifestation of the community's evolving identity, no longer just a temporary haven, but a permanent, defensible homeland, a castrum or fortified place, committed to safeguarding its existence through its own labor and vigilance. By the 11th century, the informal, consensus-based governance of the early settlement on Monte Titano was no longer adequate for the community's needs. The population had grown, property ownership had become more complex, and interactions with the surrounding feudal world required a more formalized political structure. This led to the emergence of the commune, a political transformation that was occurring across northern and central Italy as towns sought to establish self-government. The first documentary evidence of San Marino acting as a formal political entity dates to this period. The Placito Ferratrano of 885 AD, a judicial document, recognized the community as a distinct, self-governing body, but the full development of its institutions took place over the next 2 centuries. This transition marked the crucial shift from a society governed by religious custom to a state governed by established political procedure. The central institution of this new political order was the Erengo. This was not a representative body in the modern sense, but a general assembly of all patres familiarum, or heads of families. The Erengo was the ultimate sovereign power, an embodiment of the principle that authority resided in the collective of the citizens. This form of direct democracy was a common feature of early Italian communes, but in the small, close-knit society of San Marino, it was particularly effective. The Erengo was responsible for all major decisions, electing officials, enacting laws, and determining matters of war and peace. It was a profoundly conservative institution, rooted in the idea that governance was the shared responsibility of the land-owning patriarchs of the community. The formalization of the Erengo represented the definitive transition from a purely religious community to a political one. While the Bishop of Montefeltro still claimed ecclesiastical authority, the Samarinese successfully asserted their temporal independence. They were no longer simply a congregation of the faithful, but a body of citizens organized for the purpose of self-rule. This political evolution was not a radical revolution, but a gradual process of institutionalizing the principles of collective ownership and shared responsibility that had existed since the community's founding. The establishment of the commune and the Arengo provided a durable political framework that allowed San Marino to navigate the complex feudal landscape, not as a collection of refugees, but as a recognized and sovereign political entity. As the commune of San Marino matured, the Arengo, the assembly of all family heads, became increasingly unwieldy as a day-to-day governing body. While it retained its ultimate sovereign authority, the practicalities of legislation and administration in a growing society required a more efficient and responsive institution. This necessity led to the most significant political evolution in the Republic's history, the delegation of the Arengo's powers to a smaller representative body. By the 13th century, this institution was formalized as the Great and General Council. Initially composed of 60 members elected from the Arengo, the council became the legislative heart of the Republic. It was tasked with debating and passing laws, managing the state's finances, and overseeing all administrative functions. This transition from direct to representative democracy was a pragmatic solution to the challenges of scale, allowing for more structured and consistent governance while preserving the principle that power ultimately derived from the citizenry. Even more revolutionary was the solution the commune devised for its executive branch. The historical landscape of 13th century Italy was dominated by the rise of the signory, where powerful individuals or families seized control of communes, subverting republican institutions to create hereditary lordships. To inoculate themselves against this political plague, the Samarinese engineered a unique and radical form of executive power: the captain's regent. The first recorded pair, Filippo da Stirpeto and Oddo di Cello, were elected in 1243. The institution was a masterstroke of political engineering designed to prevent the concentration of power. 2 individuals were elected as joint heads of state, ensuring that no single person could exercise unchecked authority, as each captain regent held veto power over the other. Their term of office was severely limited to just 6 months, a remarkably short tenure that made it virtually impossible for an individual to build a personal power base or cultivate the loyalties necessary for a coup. At the end of their term, they returned to the status of private citizens and were subject to a process of review where any citizen could bring grievances against their conduct in office. This system of dual short-term and accountable executive leadership was a deliberate and sophisticated mechanism to safeguard liberty. The captain's regent held immense power. They presided over the council, directed the administration, and commanded the military, but it was a power that was temporary, shared, and subject to constant scrutiny. This institutional arrangement was the ultimate expression of the Republic's foundational ideology, a practical system forged to ensure that the freedom bequeathed by Marinus would be preserved, not just in spirit, but in the very structure of the state. The sophisticated political institutions developed by the Samarinese commune required a physical counterpart to ensure their survival. The spirit of freedom needed walls of stone. The construction and expansion of San Marino's fortifications throughout the High Middle Ages were a direct, material expression of the Republic's core principle of self-defense. This was not a project of aggression, but a massive, centuries-long investment in armed neutrality. The first and most formidable of these structures was the Guaita, or First Tower. Erected in the 11th century on the highest of Monte Titano's peaks, it was a purely military installation. Initially a simple watchtower, it was progressively expanded into a powerful fortress, serving as a guard post, a barracks, and, when necessary, a prison. Its strategic placement provided an unassailable anchor for the community's defences, a bastion built to withstand a prolonged siege. As the political landscape of the Romagna grew more volatile with the Guelph and Ghibelline conflicts, a single fortress was deemed insufficient. In the 13th century, the Sesta, or Second Tower, was constructed on the next highest peak. This addition created a complex, layered defensive system, allowing for interlocking fields of fire and preventing an enemy from concentrating their forces on a single point. The cesta commanded a different vantage point, guarding against approaches that the Guaita could not fully cover. Its construction demonstrates a growing sophistication in military architecture and a clear understanding of the tactical challenges posed by the era's warfare. Later, in the 14th century, the system was completed with the addition of the Montal, the third tower. Positioned on the smallest and southernmost peak, the Montal was primarily a strategic lookout post, designed to give early warning of any forces approaching from the most likely direction of attack. These towers were not isolated strongpoints, but the key nodes in an expanding network of fortifications. Over the 13th and 14th centuries, two major sets of defensive walls were constructed, linking the towers and enclosing the growing city. This was an immense undertaking for a small community, requiring a significant portion of its wealth and manpower. The construction of these walls was a collective civic act, a physical manifestation of the shared responsibility for the Republic's defense. The result was a fortress city, a near-impregnable stronghold where every citizen was a defender. This commitment to fortification was the practical application of their political ideology. San Marino sought no one's territory and would not be a pawn in the region's power struggles, but it declared through its massive stone defenses that its own sovereignty was absolute and would be protected at any cost. The survival of San Marino's institutions depended entirely on navigating the treacherous political landscape of medieval Romagna. The Republic was a tiny, independent commune surrounded by two larger, predatory powers: the ambitious feudal lords who carved out personal domains from the chaos, and the Papal States, which sought to assert its temporal authority over the entire region. San Marino's foreign policy was a masterclass in delicate diplomacy, a constant balancing act between defiance and accommodation. The most immediate and persistent threat came from the Malatesta family, the powerful lords of nearby Rimini. For centuries, the Malatesta viewed the Mountain Republic with a mixture of avarice and strategic interest. They sought to control it, not necessarily through outright conquest, which would have been costly, but by reducing it to a vassal state, a fortified outpost in their ongoing wars with rivals like the Montefeltro family of Urbino. San Marino's relationship with the Malatesta was therefore pragmatic and fluid. At times, the Republic entered into alliances of convenience with Rimini, fighting alongside them against a common enemy. At other times, they fiercely resisted Malatesta encroachment, relying on their fortifications and the unity of their citizen militia. They often paid tribute or feudal dues to secure peace, a practical concession that acknowledged the reality of their neighbors' military superiority without ever formally surrendering their core sovereignty. This was a strategy of bending without breaking, of paying for peace while preparing for war. The other great power was the papacy, which claimed the entire region as part of its temporal domain based on historical donations from Frankish kings. The primary challenge from this direction came not from papal armies, but from the legal and ecclesiastical claims of the local bishop of Montefeltro, who asserted both spiritual and temporal jurisdiction over the Samarinese. The Republic engaged in a protracted legal struggle, arguing its case in ecclesiastical courts. A critical turning point came in 1291, when a learned papal judge, Guglielmo Duranti, was sent to adjudicate the dispute. After reviewing the evidence and ancient traditions, he ruled in favor of San Marino, affirming its exemption from the bishop's temporal control. This decision was a monumental diplomatic victory, providing the Republic with a powerful legal precedent to fend off future ecclesiastical claims. San Marino survived not by being the strongest power, but by being the most astute, using diplomacy, law, and strategic alliances to play its powerful neighbors against each other, ensuring that it was always more useful to them as a neutral, independent ally than as a conquered territory. The turn of the 16th century brought a new and existential threat to the Italian peninsula, one that fundamentally altered the political landscape of the Romagna. This threat was Cesare Borgia, the ambitious and ruthless son of Pope Alexander VI. Armed with his father's papal authority, French military support, and a strategic brilliance unconstrained by morality, Borgia embarked on a lightning campaign to carve a new, hereditary duchy for his family out of the patchwork of papal territories and independent lordships in central Italy. Between 1499 and 1503, he systematically dismantled the power of the region's established feudal families. One by one, the old powers that had surrounded San Marino for centuries, the Malatesta of Rimini, the Sforza of Pesaro, and even their sometime ally, the Montefeltro of Urbino, were conquered, exiled, or eliminated. Borgia's methods were a terrifying combination of military force, political treachery, and assassination, creating a centralized, efficient, and brutally administered state on San Marino's doorstep. For the Samarinese, this was a danger of an entirely different order. They were accustomed to dealing with feudal lords who sought tribute or a strategic alliance. Borgia sought absolute subjugation. He was not a neighbor to be managed, but a state builder who could not tolerate an island of independence within his new domain. As his conquests brought his forces ever closer, the Republic faced the most direct threat to its existence it had ever known. The reaction on Monte Titano was immediate and resolute. The Great and General Council authorized emergency expenditures for the strengthening of all fortifications. The citizen militia was mobilized, and every able-bodied man was put to work repairing walls, deepening ditches, and stockpiling arms and provisions. Diplomatic channels were activated, with envoys sent to Venice and other Italian powers to gauge their positions, but the Republic understood that its ultimate survival would depend on its own readiness. They meticulously prepared for a siege, calculating their stores of grain, water, and gunpowder. Their military preparations were not based on any illusion of defeating Borgia's professional army in open battle, but on the cold calculation of making the cost of conquering their mountain fortress prohibitively high. They gathered intelligence on Borgia's siege techniques and the capabilities of his artillery, adapting their defenses accordingly. The Republic was on a total war footing, its entire society organized for the singular purpose of withstanding the assault that seemed not just possible, but inevitable. Every citizen understood that the coming confrontation would not be a negotiation for tribute, but a final defense of their libertas perpetua. The anticipated siege by Cesare Borgia's forces never came. San Marino's survival during this period was not the result of a climactic battle, but a testament to a shrewd and multifaceted defensive strategy that made the Republic an unappetizing target for even the most ambitious conqueror. Borgia, for all his ruthlessness, was a pragmatist who conducted a cold cost-benefit analysis before every military action. The Samarinese leadership understood this and tailored their strategy accordingly. Their primary diplomatic effort was not to seek a powerful protector, which would have compromised their sovereignty, but to project an image of unbreakable resolve to Borgia himself. They made it clear through their actions the constant strengthening of their walls, the mobilization of their entire population, and the stockpiling of resources that any attempt to take the mountain would result in a protracted and bloody siege. From Borgia's perspective, the conquest of San Marino offered minimal reward. The Republic possessed no significant agricultural wealth, controlled no vital trade routes, and had little in the way of taxable assets. The strategic value of the mountain was purely defensive, and Borgia's ambitions were offensive. A siege would have been a logistical nightmare, requiring his army and expensive artillery to be tied down for months in an effort to subdue a small, impoverished community. This would have diverted critical resources and manpower from far more valuable targets, like Bologna or Florence. The Republic's centuries-old reputation for steadfastness was also a known factor. They were not a city ruled by a single lord who could be bribed or assassinated, but a unified citizenry with a documented history of choosing hardship over subjugation. While this strategy of deterrence was crucial, the ultimate deliverance came from an external event that no one could have predicted. On August 18, 1503, Pope Alexander VI died suddenly, likely from malaria. Cesare Borgia, who fell gravely ill at the same time, was instantly deprived of his primary source of political legitimacy, funding, and military authority. The entire foundation of his new state vanished overnight. His enemies, the very lords he had dispossessed, immediately rose to reclaim their territories. Borgia's meticulously constructed duchy collapsed as quickly as it had been built. The threat to San Marino evaporated not because of a change of heart or a diplomatic breakthrough, but because the political reality of the Romagna had been fundamentally and irrevocably altered. The Republic had survived by making itself too costly to attack, a fortress of prudence that held out just long enough for fortune to intervene. By the end of the 16th century, San Marino had survived for over a millennium on a foundation of oral tradition, customary law, and a series of individual statutes passed by the Orengo and later the Great and General Council. While effective, this uncodified system was vulnerable to misinterpretation and the political pressures of the era. The dawn of the 17th century, a period of rising absolutism across Europe, prompted the Republic to undertake its most significant internal project, the systematic codification of its entire legal and constitutional framework. This was not an act of revolution but of consolidation, a deliberate effort to gather, organize, and commit to righting the ancient customs and practices that had guaranteed their liberty. The result, promulgated on October 8, 1600, was the Statuti della Repubblica di San Marino, a landmark achievement in the history of constitutional governance. Written in Latin, the formal language of law and statecraft, the statutes were organized into 6 books, each addressing a specific aspect of the state. The first book was purely constitutional, meticulously detailing the powers, responsibilities, and limitations of the Great and General Council, the Captain's Regent, and other key state offices. It was a formal blueprint of the Republic's unique political machinery. The second book covered civil law, establishing the procedures for lawsuits, contracts, and property disputes, providing a clear and stable legal environment for the citizenry. The third and fourth books dealt with criminal law and judicial procedure, defining crimes, prescribing punishments ranging from fines to banishment, and outlining the structure of the courts and the process of appeals. This created a system of justice based on written law rather than the arbitrary will of a ruler. The final 2 books addressed a range of administrative and public matters, from rural administration and public health to road maintenance and the duties of officials. Crucially, the statutes were not merely a law code, they were a written constitution, one of the earliest still in effect in the world. They explicitly reaffirmed the sovereignty of the people, acting through the council, and enshrined the mechanisms designed to prevent tyranny. By committing their entire system of governance to a single authoritative text, the Sammarinese accomplished several critical goals. They created legal certainty, protected their institutions from internal subversion, and presented a clear, unarguable definition of their state to the outside world. The statutes of 1600 were the ultimate defense of their liberty, a declaration that their republic was not an accident of history, but a deliberate and sophisticated political creation, governed by the rule of law. For over a century after the codification of its laws, San Marino experienced a period of relative peace, its independence respected, and its neutrality a given. This stability was shattered in 1739 by the most severe crisis in its history, an occupation initiated not by a secular prince, but by a high-ranking official of the Papal States. Cardinal Giulio Alberoni, a powerful and ambitious statesman serving as the papal legate of Ravenna, saw the tiny republic as an anachronistic anomaly within his jurisdiction. Acting on his own initiative and using the pretext of restoring order and bringing the republic back under papal authority, Alberoni orchestrated a plan of annexation. He cultivated a small faction of disgruntled Sammarinese, manufactured claims of sedition, and used these as a justification for intervention. On October 17, 1739, his forces entered the Republic without a single shot being fired, occupying the territory, and deposing the captain's regent. This was not a military conquest, but a political seizure, an act of force carried out under the guise of legal and ecclesiastical authority. Alberoni immediately set about dismantling the Republic's ancient institutions. He abolished the Great and General Council and the office of the Captain's Regent, forcing the Sammarinese leadership to swear an oath of allegiance to the Papal States. The occupation was a direct and total violation of the Republic's sovereignty, threatening to extinguish over 400 years of continuous independence. The Sammarinese response was not one of armed rebellion, which would have been suicidal, but a campaign of determined passive resistance and astute diplomacy. The majority of the population refused to recognize the new regime, and secret appeals were smuggled out of the occupied territory. Their strategy was to bypass Alberoni and appeal directly to a higher authority, Pope Clement XII in Rome. They dispatched envoys who argued their case with legal precision, citing the ancient traditions of their liberty, the historical papal recognitions of their independence, and the illegality of Alberoni's actions, which had been undertaken without direct papal sanction. The appeal was a calculated risk, relying on the Pope's respect for justice and historical precedent to overrule his own powerful legate. The diplomatic effort was successful. Pope Clement XII, after reviewing the case, sent a papal envoy, Monsignor Enrico Enriquez, to investigate. Enriquez's findings confirmed the Sammarinese position, and on February 5, 1740, the Pope ordered the full restoration of the Republic's independence and the withdrawal of Alberoni's forces. The occupation had lasted less than 4 months, but it was a profound trauma. The Republic had been saved not by its military strength, but by its moral and legal fortitude, its unwavering belief in the justice of its cause, and its ability to successfully navigate the complex corridors of ecclesiastical power. Following the Alberonian crisis, San Marino entered a new phase of its existence, defined not by immediate threats but by its profound political isolation. The 18th century was the zenith of European absolutism, a political order dominated by powerful, centralized monarchies like Bourbon France and Habsburg Austria. In Italy, the patchwork of medieval lordships had consolidated into larger, hereditary duchies and kingdoms, all operating on monarchical principles. In this world, a self-governing republic with elected, short-term heads of state was more than an anachronism. It was a political fossil. The vibrant ecosystem of independent Italian communes, of which San Marino was a part, had long been extinct. Florence was now the capital of the Grand Duchy of Tuscany. Milan was an Austrian possession, and the once proud republics of Siena and Pisa were memories. San Marino persisted as the sole living remnant of this bygone political era. Its survival was no longer primarily a matter of military deterrence, but of its unique status as an intellectual curiosity. For the thinkers of the Enlightenment, who were beginning to question the divine right of kings and explore republican theories, San Marino was a subject of fascination. It was a real-world, albeit tiny, laboratory of republican governance that had functioned continuously for over a millennium. Political philosophers and travelers on the Grand Tour would visit the mountain not as a strategic objective, but as a historical monument, a living museum of a political system that had vanished everywhere else. This perception was a form of defense more effective than any wall. To conquer San Marino would have been seen not as a strategic gain, but as an act of historical vandalism, an erasure of a unique legacy that even absolute monarchs found intriguing. The Republic's poverty and lack of strategic resources continued to be a key element of its security. It possessed nothing that a large monarchy would want to expend resources to acquire. Its continued existence did not challenge the power of its neighbors. It merely occupied a small mountainous territory of little economic consequence. The Papal States, its most immediate neighbor, had learned from the Alberoni affair that the Republic's annexation created more diplomatic trouble than it was worth. San Marino persisted through this era not by asserting its power, but by quietly and stubbornly continuing its ancient traditions. It was a quiet holdout, a community governed by its 17th-century statutes in a world of absolute sovereigns, its existence a quiet but persistent testament to an alternative political possibility. The political order of absolutist Europe, which had made San Marino a curiosity, was violently shattered by the French Revolution and the subsequent rise of Napoleon Bonaparte. His first Italian campaign, beginning in 1796, was a political and military whirlwind that redrew the map of the peninsula. Ancient states that had endured for centuries were extinguished in a matter of months. The powerful Republic of Venice, a maritime empire for 1,000 years, was dismembered. The Republic of Genoa, a banking and naval power since the Middle Ages, was transformed into a French client state. The Papal States were invaded, and the Pope himself was eventually taken prisoner. This was an era of radical, violent change, where historical longevity offered no protection against the ideological fervour and military efficiency of the French army. In February 1797, this revolutionary force arrived at San Marino's borders. A French division under the command of General Louis-Alexandre Berthier was pursuing the remnants of the Papal army, and their advance brought them to the foot of Monte Titano. For the San Marinese, this was a moment of supreme peril. By the logic of the time, their republic was a feudal remnant, a part of the old order to be swept away. However, Napoleon, a keen student of history and an admirer of classical republicanism, saw something different. He was aware of the tiny republic's unique history of continuous liberty. Instead of ordering an invasion, he halted his troops and initiated a remarkable diplomatic encounter. He dispatched Gaspard Monge, a prominent French scientist and a fervent Republican, not as a conqueror but as an envoy. Monge's mission was not to demand surrender or tribute, but to deliver a message of friendship and solidarity from the French Republic to its ancient San Marinese counterpart. Napoleon, seeing himself as the heir to the Roman tradition and the champion of republican ideals, viewed San Marino not as a relic to be erased, but as a model to be honoured. He saw in its survival a testament to the virtues of liberty that his own revolution claimed to champion. The encounter was therefore not a military confrontation, but an ideological one. The most powerful and modern military force in Europe, which had just extinguished states 100 times its size, paused at the border of the world's smallest and oldest republic to offer its respect. For the first time in centuries, San Marino was not merely being tolerated for its obscurity, but was being recognized for its principles by the dominant power of the age. The diplomatic mission led by Gaspard Monge on behalf of Napoleon Bonaparte was not limited to expressions of ideological respect. It came with a series of concrete and astonishing offers that tested the core principles of San Marinese statecraft. Monge, addressing the captains regent and the Great and General Council, formally offered a treaty of friendship and alliance with the French Republic. To demonstrate this goodwill, he offered a gift of grain to alleviate food shortages and, more significantly, 4 pieces of modern French artillery to bolster the Republic's defences. But the most radical proposal was a direct offer from Napoleon to expand San Marino's territory. He proposed to grant the Republic additional lands, including a corridor extending to the Adriatic coast, which would have given the landlocked state a seaport and significantly increased its economic viability and strategic importance. This offer was unprecedented. For centuries, San Marino's foreign policy had been geared towards preventing the loss of territory, not acquiring it. The leadership, under the influential guidance of Captain Regent Antonio Onofri, immediately recognized the profound danger latent in Napoleon's generosity. Accepting the territory would have been a catastrophic violation of their foundational strategy for survival. It would have irrevocably shattered their neutrality, transforming them from a harmless, overlooked anomaly into an active participant in the Napoleonic redrawing of Italy. The new territories would have been a gift from a conqueror, and the ownership would be contingent on that conqueror's continued success. The refusal was a masterpiece of diplomatic prudence. Onofri, speaking for the council, conveyed the Republic's profound and sincere gratitude to General Bonaparte for his magnanimous offer. However, he respectfully declined the territorial expansion. The official reasoning provided was a direct appeal to the Republic's historical experience. They had survived for centuries, he argued, precisely because of their small size and their contentment with their borders. They feared that any expansion would introduce ambitions and enmities that had been the ruin of larger states, and that their liberty was guaranteed not by the extent of their land, but by the modesty of their aspirations. They accepted the offer of grain as a gesture of friendship between peoples, but politely declined the cannons, as they had no aggressive intentions. This calculated refusal was one of the most important decisions in the Republic's history. It was a conscious choice to prioritize the long-term, time-tested strategy of neutrality and obscurity over the tempting but treacherous path of territorial gain and entanglement with a great power. The wave of liberal revolutions that swept across Europe in 1848 found fertile ground in the Italian peninsula, reigniting the movement for national unification known as the Risorgimento. San Marino, having preserved its independence through the Napoleonic era and the subsequent conservative restoration, once again found its policy of neutrality tested. The Republic's historical identity as a land of liberty made it a natural, if unofficial, sympathizer to the cause of Italian independence. This sympathy was put to its most severe test in 1849. The short-lived Roman Republic, a revolutionary state that had driven Pope Pius IX from the city, was crushed by a French army sent to restore papal authority. The leaders and soldiers of this republic became hunted men, fugitives in their own country. It was in this context that San Marino played its most crucial role in the Risorgimento. In late July 1849, Giuseppe Garibaldi, the military leader of the defeated Roman Republic, found himself and the remnants of his army, several thousand exhausted and demoralized legionaries encircled by three separate armies, the French, the Austrians, and the papal forces. Their situation was hopeless. With all escape routes cut off, Garibaldi's only option was to seek asylum in the neutral territory of the nearby Republic of San Marino. This was not a request for military alliance, but for humanitarian sanctuary, a plea for refuge based on the ancient right of asylum. For the Sammarinese government, the decision was fraught with peril. Granting refuge to Garibaldi and his army was a direct act of defiance against the victorious powers, particularly Austria, which controlled the surrounding territory and viewed Garibaldi as a dangerous revolutionary. It was an act that could have easily provided a pretext for invasion and the final extinguishment of their independence. Yet, the captains regent and the council chose to honor their tradition as a safe haven. They opened their borders to Garibaldi's forces, providing them with food and shelter. The decision was a calculated risk, a profound moral and political statement that prioritized their identity as a land of liberty over the pragmatic course of appeasing the great powers. They did not offer military aid, but they offered survival, a crucial act of solidarity that cemented the Republic's heroic reputation within the narrative of Italian unification. On July 31, 1849, Giuseppe Garibaldi and the exhausted remnants of his army, numbering around 500 soldiers, crossed the border into San Marino. Their arrival presented the Sammarinese government with an immediate and acute crisis. The Austrian army, under the command of Archduke Ernst, was in close pursuit and had established a tight cordon around the Republic's territory. The Austrians demanded the unconditional surrender of Garibaldi and his legionaries, viewing them as rebels and criminals. For San Marino, the diplomatic risks were immense. Harboring these fugitives was a clear breach of neutrality in the eyes of the Austrian Empire, a major European power that could crush the Republic with ease. Refusing them entry, however, would have been a violation of their most deeply held tradition of providing asylum. The captains regent, led by Domenico Maria Belzoppi I, engaged in intense and direct negotiations with Garibaldi. The terms of the asylum were strict and pragmatic, designed to save the lives of the fugitives while providing the Republic with a defensible diplomatic position. Garibaldi had to agree to order his men to lay down their arms and disband. The Sammarinese government would not surrender the legionaries as prisoners of war, but would guarantee their personal safety and provide them with passports to return to their homes unmolested. Garibaldi, seeing no other option, accepted these conditions. He issued a final order of the day from the main square, releasing his soldiers from their oath of loyalty and instructing them to surrender their weapons to the Samarinese authorities. The diplomatic pressure from the Austrians was relentless. Archduke Ernst threatened to invade if his demands were not met. The Samarinese leadership held firm, insisting on the terms of the asylum and their rights as a neutral state. While the bulk of his army was being disarmed and processed, Garibaldi, knowing that the Austrians would never honour a promise of safe passage for him personally, made a daring decision. On the night of July 31st, guided by local sympathisers, he and about 250 of his most loyal followers, including his pregnant wife Anita, slipped out of the Republic and began a desperate march towards the coast, hoping to reach Venice. This act, while saving Garibaldi, placed the Republic in an even more precarious position. The Austrians, furious at his escape, briefly violated Samarinese territory in a futile pursuit. Yet, the Republic had accomplished its primary goal. It had saved the lives of thousands of Italian patriots without firing a shot and without fully capitulating to the demands of a vastly superior military power, a diplomatic feat achieved at the very brink of annihilation. The proclamation of the Kingdom of Italy in 1861 represented the successful culmination of the Risorgimento. But for San Marino, it created a geopolitical situation of unprecedented danger. For centuries, the Republic's survival had depended on a strategy of balancing the competing interests of multiple, often hostile neighbours. Now, that complex political ecosystem had vanished. The Papal States, the Grand Duchy of Tuscany, and the various other entities were gone, replaced by a single, powerful and nationalistic state that completely surrounded it. San Marino was no longer a small state in a region of small states. It was a microstate entirely enclaved within a modern nation-state. The very logic of Italian nationalism, which held that all Italian-speaking peoples should be united under one flag, made the Republic's continued independence a profound anomaly. The threat was not one of military conquest, but of political absorption. From the perspective of the new Italian government, the existence of a sovereign entity on its soil was a remnant of the political fragmentation the Risorgimento had fought to overcome. The pressure to complete the unification by incorporating the last holdout was immense. It was at this critical juncture that the Republic's decision to shelter Garibaldi in 1849 paid its most significant dividend. That act had forged a bond of gratitude and respect with the very leaders who now controlled Italy's destiny. Figures like Garibaldi himself and many others in the new government remembered the refuge San Marino had provided at the revolution's darkest hour. This historical goodwill became the Republic's primary diplomatic shield. This goodwill was leveraged in a series of delicate negotiations aimed at formalizing the Republic's status. The Samarinese leadership, understanding that their ancient traditions were not enough, sought a modern, legally binding agreement. The culmination of this effort was the Convention of Friendship and Good Neighbourhood, signed on March 22, 1862. This was not a treaty of vassalage, but a formal agreement between two sovereign states. It regulated practical matters such as customs duties, trade, and the extradition of criminals, effectively creating a customs union. But its most important clause was the implicit and formal recognition of San Marino's sovereignty by the Kingdom of Italy. The treaty secured the Republic's independence, transforming its relationship with the surrounding territory from one of potential annexation to one of protected friendship. It was the final crucial diplomatic act that ensured the ancient Republic's survival, no longer as a fortress against a fractured world, but as a recognized sovereign island within a united Italy. The political security achieved in 1862 did not translate into economic prosperity. For the remainder of the 19th and the early 20th centuries, San Marino was gripped by a profound and structural economic crisis. The Republic's economy was almost entirely agrarian, based on subsistence farming on the limited and difficult terrain of Monte Titano. This agricultural base, which had been sufficient for a small medieval population, was wholly inadequate to support the growing number of citizens in the industrial age. The Republic lacked any significant natural resources, had no industrial capacity, and its customs union with Italy, while preventing tariffs, also meant it could not protect its own small-scale producers from the more efficient agricultural and manufacturing sectors of the larger kingdom. This created a chronic condition of underemployment and poverty, with population growth consistently outstripping the mountain's carrying capacity. This internal crisis coincided with the broader phenomenon of mass Italian emigration. Faced with identical pressures of rural poverty and lack of opportunity, Sammarinese citizens began to leave their homeland in unprecedented numbers. This was not a political exodus but an economic one, a desperate search for work that the Republic could not provide. The emigration occurred in two major waves. The first, in the late 19th century, was primarily directed towards neighbouring European countries, particularly France, Switzerland and Belgium, where Sammarinese labourers found work in mines, construction and factories. The second, and larger, wave at the turn of the 20th century was transatlantic. Following the well-established routes of Italian migrants, thousands of Sammarinese embarked for the Americas. Significant and lasting communities were established in the United States, with major concentrations of Sammarinese immigrants in industrial cities like Detroit, Michigan, and in New York. Others sought opportunities in South America, creating a substantial presence in Argentina and Uruguay. This was not a temporary migration of seasonal workers, but a permanent demographic shift. Entire families left, establishing new lives abroad while often retaining their Sammarinese citizenship. The result was the creation of a large and enduring global diaspora. By the early 20th century, a significant percentage of the Republic's legal citizenry resided outside its borders. This mass emigration fundamentally altered the Republic's social fabric, providing a crucial economic safety valve that prevented total destitution at home, but at the cost of a sustained demographic drain that would last for decades. When the First World War erupted in August 1914, San Marino's response was immediate and consistent with its centuries-old foreign policy. It declared its absolute neutrality. This position became infinitely more complex and precarious when the Kingdom of Italy, the nation that completely surrounded it, entered the war on the side of the Entente powers in May 1915. Suddenly, the Republic was an enclave of peace, entirely within a nation mobilized for total war. The Italian government exerted considerable pressure on San Marino to abandon its neutral stance, but the Sammarinese government, under the leadership of the captain's regent, held firm to its legal and historical position. To do otherwise would have set a dangerous precedent, undermining the very principle of sovereignty they had guarded for so long. While the state remained officially neutral, the sympathies of the Sammarinese people were overwhelmingly with Italy. To manage this internal pressure and demonstrate solidarity without formally entering the conflict, the Republic pursued a two-pronged strategy. The first was a significant humanitarian effort. Despite its own limited resources, San Marino opened its borders to a wave of Italian refugees, particularly those fleeing the fighting on the nearby northeastern front. The Republic also funded and operated a field hospital on Italian soil, staffed by Sammarinese doctors and volunteers, to treat wounded Italian soldiers. This was a material contribution to the Italian war effort, framed as a neutral act of humanitarian aid, which allowed the Republic to provide support without becoming a co-belligerent. The second, more direct, strategy was to permit and even quietly encourage the formation of a small volunteer corps. While the state did not conscript soldiers, it did not prevent its citizens from enlisting in the Italian army. A group of Sammarinese volunteers was formed, with some serving as combatants, and a larger contingent forming a dedicated medical unit attached to the 4th Italian Army. This allowed for a direct expression of pro-Italian sentiment and participation in the conflict on a personal, rather than a state, level. The Italian government officially recognized the service of these volunteers, and their actions were a powerful symbol of the bond between the two nations. Through this carefully calibrated policy of official neutrality, humanitarian action, and sanctioned volunteerism, San Marino successfully navigated the immense pressures of the Great War, preserving its sovereignty while simultaneously strengthening its relationship with its powerful neighbor. The post-war turmoil that gripped Italy and gave rise to Benito Mussolini's fascist movement did not stop at San Marino's borders. The same forces of social unrest, economic hardship, and intense nationalism that fueled fascism in Italy found echoes within the Republic. In August 1922, just 2 months before Mussolini's march on Rome, the Partito Fascista Sammarinese, PFS, was founded. It was a direct ideological and political extension of its Italian counterpart, adopting its symbols, its hierarchical structure, and its methods of political intimidation. The rise of the PFS was not a popular grassroots movement, but a seizure of power facilitated by the overwhelming political pressure from fascist Italy. The Sammarinese socialists, who had a strong presence in the government, became the primary target of fascist violence and political coercion, mirroring the campaign being waged across the peninsula. By 1923, the PFS had effectively gained control of the state. Through a campaign of intimidation and the forced resignation of political opponents, they secured a majority in the Great and General Council. This marked the beginning of the systematic dismantling of the Republic's democratic traditions. The ancient institution of the Captain's Regent, the symbol of the Republic's distributed and temporary power, was subverted. While the office was not formally abolished, the free election process was. The PFS-controlled council began appointing the Captain's Regent from within its own ranks, transforming them from heads of state into party functionaries. All other political parties were outlawed, and San Marino was reconstituted as a single-party state. The alignment with Mussolini's Italy became total. San Marino did not lose its de jure independence, but its de facto sovereignty was severely compromised. Its foreign policy became a mirror of Rome's, and its internal governance was remodeled along fascist corporate state lines. The Great and General Council was eventually replaced by a Prince and Sovereign Council composed entirely of fascists. For nearly 2 decades, the Republic's ancient democratic machinery was suspended. The system of checks and balances, the short terms of office, and the accountability of leaders, the very mechanisms designed to prevent tyranny, were swept away. This period represents the most profound and sustained break in the Republic's long history of self-governance, an interlude where its foundational principle of liberty was suppressed by the dominant political ideology of its powerful and now totalitarian neighbor. With the outbreak of the Second World War in 1939, San Marino once again declared its neutrality, a position made deeply complicated by its fascist government's ideological alignment with Mussolini's Italy. This precarious neutrality held until the pivotal events of 1943. The fall of Mussolini in July led to the immediate and swift collapse of the Partito Fascista Sammarinese, and a provisional government restored the Republic's democratic institutions. However, this internal change coincided with the German occupation of Italy, which brought the front line of the war to San Marino's doorstep. The formidable German defensive position, the Gothic Line, was constructed just a few kilometers south of the Republic's borders, placing it in a direct and perilous position between the advancing Allied forces and the entrenched Wehrmacht. It was in this context that the Republic undertook its largest humanitarian effort in its history. As the fighting in Italy intensified, San Marino reaffirmed its neutrality and opened its borders to refugees. The result was a demographic crisis of staggering proportions. The Republic's resident population of about 15,000 was overwhelmed by an influx of over 100,000 evacuees, primarily Italians fleeing the devastation of the front lines. Every available building, churches, public offices, private homes, and ancient stone galleries, was converted into emergency housing. This massive act of asylum also extended to several hundred Jewish refugees who, by finding sanctuary within the neutral territory, escaped the Holocaust. The San Marinese government provided what food and resources it could, sharing its meagre supplies with a refugee population that outnumbered its own citizens by nearly 7-1. This humanitarian stance did not shield the Republic from the realities of the war. Allied military command received faulty intelligence, suggesting that the German army was using San Marinese territory for observation posts and to store munitions. Based on this incorrect information, on June 26, 1944, the British Royal Air Force conducted an aerial bombardment of the Republic. The raid was a tragic error. Over 100 bombs were dropped on the neutral state, killing more than 60 civilians and refugees, and wounding hundreds more. The San Marinese government issued a formal protest to the Allied powers, who later acknowledged the bombing was a mistake based on false intelligence. The event was a profound trauma, a devastating moment where the Republic's commitment to providing a safe haven was violated by the very forces fighting for the liberation of the continent. The mistaken Allied bombing in June 1944 was a tragic prelude to direct combat on San Marinese soil. As the Allied autumn offensive pushed against the German Gothic Line, the strategic high ground of Monte Titano became a military objective of critical importance. Despite the Republic's declared neutrality, retreating elements of the German army, specifically the 278th Infantry Division, occupied the mountain in mid-September 1944. They established formidable defensive positions, using the mountain's ridges and ancient fortifications as natural artillery and observation posts to control the surrounding terrain and slow the Allied advance. This act was a flagrant violation of the Republic's neutrality, born of German military necessity. The Allied forces, primarily the British V Corps, could not allow this strategic position to remain in enemy hands. The decision was made to pursue the German forces onto San Marinese territory. The assault, which began on September 17th, was led by the 4th Indian Infantry Division, a unit renowned for its expertise in mountain warfare, and which included several Gurkha regiments. The ensuing conflict was brief but exceptionally intense. The German defenders were well entrenched, and the Allied soldiers had to fight a difficult uphill battle against fortified machine gun nests and mortar positions. The fighting was characterized by close-quarters combat in the narrow, steep streets of the Republic's towns, and on the rocky slopes of the mountain itself. Over 3 days of heavy fighting, the Allied forces systematically pushed the German defenders back. The battle culminated on September 20th, when soldiers of the Queen's Own Cameron Highlanders and Gurkha regiments secured the summit of Monte Titano and the capital city. The German forces conducted a fighting withdrawal, leaving the Republic in Allied hands. The cost of this brief but brutal conflict was significant. The German army suffered over 100 casualties, while the Allies sustained several hundred killed and wounded. Tragically, San Marinese civilians were also caught in the crossfire, with dozens killed and more wounded. The Battle of San Marino was a stark demonstration of the brutal logic of total war, where the ancient right of neutrality offered no protection from the strategic imperatives of modern armies. It remains the only time in the Republic's long history that its territory became an active battleground in a major international conflict. The end of the Second World War plunged Italy into a period of intense political polarization between the Christian Democrats, supported by the Western powers, and a powerful communist socialist bloc. This ideological struggle was mirrored within San Marino, which, in the first post-war elections of 1945, produced a result that sent shockwaves across the West. A coalition of the San Marinese Communist Party and the San Marinese Socialist Party won a majority in the Great and General Council, forming a new government. This event was historically unprecedented. It was the first time in Western European history that a communist-led government had come to power through free and democratic elections. For the next 12 years, the Republic would be governed by this left-wing coalition, an anomaly that could not be tolerated in the new geopolitical climate of the Cold War. The reaction from the new, staunchly anti-communist Christian Democrat government in Italy and its American allies was one of immediate and sustained hostility. They viewed the San Marinese government not as the legitimate outcome of a democratic process, but as a potential Soviet foothold in the heart of Italy. The response was not a military intervention, but a slow, suffocating political and economic blockade. Italy, which controlled every road, every power line, and every channel of commerce into the Republic, began to exert immense pressure. Border controls were tightened, creating significant obstacles for the thousands of Italian workers who commuted into San Marino, and for the flow of goods and tourists that were the lifeblood of the Republic's fragile economy. The Italian government refused to renew the monetary convention and blocked the construction of a planned casino, which the San Marinese government had hoped would provide a vital new source of revenue. The United States declared the Republic off-limits to its personnel and actively discouraged investment. The blockade was designed to isolate San Marino, to cripple its economy, and to demonstrate to its citizens that their electoral choice had severe consequences. Internally, the government responded with a series of social reforms, including the establishment of the Republic's first social security system, but it was a constant struggle against externally imposed economic strangulation. This period, known as the Fatti di Rovereta of 1957, when the crisis culminated in a constitutional standoff, was a defining test of the Republic's resilience, pitting its democratic will against the overwhelming geopolitical forces of the Cold War. The resolution of the political crisis of 1957 and the subsequent shift to a centre-right government marked a fundamental turning point for San Marino, away from ideological struggle and towards a pragmatic and aggressive economic modernization. The new government inherited a state that was impoverished, agrarian, and economically isolated. The response was a deliberate and multi-pronged strategy to fundamentally transform the Republic's economic base, moving it away from subsistence agriculture towards a modern, diversified, and high-income model. The first and most visible engine of this transformation was the mass development of the tourism industry. Capitalizing on Italy's post-war economic boom and the explosion of popular tourism, San Marino marketed itself as a unique historical destination. The government encouraged the construction of hotels, restaurants, and retail shops, creating an infrastructure to support a massive influx of visitors. A key component of this strategy was the sale of duty-free goods, which made the Republic a popular shopping destination for the millions of tourists visiting the nearby Adriatic Riviera. Parallel to the growth of tourism, the Republic made a strategic decision to develop a robust financial sector. It enacted a series of laws that created a highly favorable, low-tax environment with strict banking secrecy, positioning itself as an attractive offshore financial center. This led to the establishment of numerous banks and financial institutions, which attracted significant foreign capital and provided a substantial new source of revenue for the state through fees and corporate taxes. This financialization of the economy was a critical step, moving the state's income away from reliance on Italian subsidies or the volatile tourism sector. To ensure a stable employment base and avoid total dependence on tourism and finance, the government also fostered the growth of a light industrial and manufacturing sector. Small and medium-sized enterprises were encouraged through tax incentives and streamlined regulations. This led to the development of successful industries in ceramics, textiles, paints, and eventually electronics and precision engineering. This industrial base provided stable, year-round employment for the San Marinese population, a crucial element in achieving one of the highest standards of living and lowest unemployment rates in Europe by the end of the 20th century. The state also cleverly monetized its sovereignty through the production and sale of highly sought-after postage stamps and commemorative coins to the international philatelic and numismatic markets, a niche but extremely high-margin enterprise. This combination of tourism, finance, manufacturing, and niche sovereign enterprise created the San Marinese economic miracle, a rapid and comprehensive transformation from one of Europe's poorest states to one of its most prosperous. The economic prosperity achieved in the post-war decades provided San Marino with the stability and confidence to pursue a fundamental shift in its foreign policy. For 17 centuries, the Republic's survival had been predicated on a strategy of isolation and neutrality, of remaining as inconspicuous as possible on the world stage. The latter half of the 20th century, however, saw a deliberate and calculated reversal of this ancient doctrine. The leadership recognized that in an increasingly interconnected and institutionalized world, true sovereignty was guaranteed not by isolation, but by active and equal participation in the international community. This led to a proactive diplomatic campaign to join the key international organizations that defined the post-war global order. The first major step in this process was San Marino's accession to the Council of Europe in 1988. This was a significant move, as membership required a state to meet stringent criteria regarding democracy, human rights, and the rule of law. For San Marino, joining was a formal affirmation that its ancient, unique political system was fully compatible with modern European democratic standards. It was a validation of its institutions on an international level, moving it from the category of a historical curiosity to that of a modern European state. This process required a thorough review of its legal system and a commitment to adhering to the European Convention on Human Rights, a process of modernization that was as much internal as it was external. The culmination of this new foreign policy was the Republic's admission to the United Nations. After a period as an official observer, San Marino became a full member state on March 2, 1992. This was the ultimate and unequivocal affirmation of its sovereignty. By taking its seat in the General Assembly, the Republic was recognized as a legal equal to the world's largest superpowers. This act was of profound symbolic and practical importance. It provided an international forum in which San Marino could defend its interests, a system of collective security, and a final, unarguable refutation of any lingering questions about its status as an independent nation. The journey from a tiny, isolated refuge clinging to a mountain to a full member of the global community of nations was complete. This diplomatic achievement solidified the Republic's place in the modern world, ensuring that its ancient liberty was now protected not just by its own resilience, but by the full weight of international law. While San Marino's entry into the United Nations marked its full integration into the modern world, its internal political machinery remains a unique blend of ancient tradition and contemporary adaptation. The core institutions forged in the Middle Ages, the Great and General Council and the Captain's Regent, continue to function, but the role of the citizenry in direct governance has evolved significantly. The original Arengo, the assembly of all family heads that held supreme power in the early commune, had long since delegated its legislative authority to the council. For centuries, it lay dormant as a political institution. However, in 1906, after a period of oligarchic control, the Sammarinese people successfully demanded the restoration of a more democratic system, including the revival of the Arengo in a new, modern form. Today, the Arengo is no longer a legislative assembly, but a powerful and unique instrument of direct democracy. Twice a year, on the Sunday following the investiture of the new Captain's Regent, a session of the Arengo is held. Any citizen can submit petitions or proposals for the consideration of the Great and General Council. These petitions, if deemed to be of public interest, must be debated by the Council within 6 months. This institution provides a direct and formal channel for citizen-initiated legislation, a modern echo of the ancient assembly where every family head had a voice. This principle of direct democracy was further expanded and formalized with the introduction of the modern referendum. While the first referendum was held in 1919, the institution has become a central feature of 21st century Sammarinese politics. Citizens can initiate a referendum to abrogate existing laws or propose new ones, a powerful check on the authority of the elected council. This tool has been used to decide on critical and often contentious issues, from electoral reform to social policy. including the landmark 2021 referendum that legalized abortion. The evolution of the Republic's ancient institutions to meet modern demands is a continuous process. The system has had to adapt to the requirements of European integration, aligning its laws with international standards on finance, human rights, and justice, all while preserving its unique structure. The Orengo of the 21st century is therefore not a single institution, but a dynamic system that combines the representative democracy of the Council, the dual executive of the Captain's Regent, and the direct democracy of petitions and referendums, a political framework that is both deeply historical and remarkably modern. While San Marino's survival has often been attributed to diplomacy and geography, the Republic has maintained a small but highly specialized military force throughout its history, a physical embodiment of its commitment to self-defense. These corps, now largely ceremonial, are living institutions with deep historical roots. The most ancient of these is the Crossbowman Corps, whose existence is first documented in the statutes of 1295. In the medieval period, the crossbow was a decisive military technology, and this corps formed the core of the Republic's fighting force. Every citizen was expected to be proficient with the weapon, but the crossbowmen were the elite specialists, a standing body of soldiers responsible for the defense of the city's walls and towers. Their role was purely defensive, a citizen militia whose sole purpose was to repel any attack on the Republic's territory. Today, the Corps is a celebrated historical and ceremonial unit, preserving the ancient skill of crossbow shooting through training and public demonstrations, a direct link to the Republic's medieval military traditions. A more modern yet equally vital component is the Guard of the Rock, formally established in 1754. This unit was created to perform the dual roles of border patrol and artillery service. Its primary function was to guard the frontiers of the Republic, preventing smuggling and controlling entry, a crucial task for a state entirely enclaved within another. Their secondary role as the Republic's artillerymen meant they were responsible for manning the cannons in the fortifications, a duty they still perform ceremonially. In the modern era, the Guard of the Rock has a highly visible public duty. They are responsible for the changing of the guard ceremony at the Palazzo Pubblico, the seat of government. Their distinctive uniform, with its red pom-pom and green and white accents, makes them a symbol of the state's continuous vigilance. Other specialized units complete this picture. The Guard of the Great and General Council, established in the 18th century, serves as the ceremonial bodyguard for the Captain's Regent and the Council during state functions and religious festivals. The Gendarmerie, founded in 1842, functions as the Republic's modern police force, responsible for law enforcement and public order. Together, these small, professional, and historically significant military corps are not an instrument of foreign policy, but an internal expression of sovereignty. They are the guardians of the state's institutions, a continuous, living symbol of the Republic's foundational principle that liberty must be defended by its own citizens. The most potent and enduring symbol of San Marino's unique political identity is the institution of the Captain's Regent. Twice a year, on April Honest and October Honest, the Republic conducts an investiture ceremony that is one of the oldest and most continuous political rituals in the world. This event is the modern expression of the system established in 1243, a formal and public reaffirmation of the principles of shared, temporary, and accountable power. The process begins with the Great and General Council electing 2 of its members to serve as joint heads of state for the next 6 months. The 2 individuals chosen cannot be from the same family and must meet strict criteria of age and citizenship. Their function is not merely ceremonial. They are the chief executives of the Republic, jointly presiding over the council, the judiciary, and the administration, and representing the state internationally. The investiture ceremony itself is a deeply historical public spectacle. The Captain's Regent-elect, dressed in their traditional formal attire of black silk velvet, ermine, and plumed hats, proceed from the Palazzo Pubblico to the Basilica del Santo. There, they attend a solemn mass before returning to the palace for the formal transfer of power. In the main hall of the council, the outgoing captains regent deliver a final address, and the Secretary of State for Internal Affairs reads the formal act of election. The new captains regent then take their oath of office, swearing to uphold the laws and statutes of the Republic and to govern with justice and impartiality. The entire ceremony is a precise and unchanging ritual that has been performed without interruption for nearly 8 centuries. The significance of this institution lies in its deliberate fragmentation of executive authority. The dual nature of the office ensures that no single individual can make a unilateral decision, as both must agree for any action to be taken. The extremely short, non-consecutive 6-month term makes it impossible for a leader to consolidate personal power or cultivate a cult of personality. Upon leaving office, they immediately return to being ordinary members of the council and are subject to the Syndicate of the Regency, a judicial review where any citizen can lodge a formal complaint against their conduct during their tenure. This system is the ultimate safeguard against the tyranny of a single ruler, a practical and continuously functioning mechanism that has ensured the peaceful and orderly transfer of power for longer than almost any other state in existence. It is the living heart of the Republic's constitution. In its quest for economic viability, San Marino pioneered a novel form of state revenue by monetizing the most unique asset it possessed, its sovereignty. The Republic's entry into the world of philately was a direct consequence of the 1862 convention with Italy, which formalized postal arrangements. Recognizing a potential source of income beyond agriculture or tribute, the government issued its first postage stamps in 1877. This was a calculated economic decision, and the Sammarinese quickly realized that the primary market was not domestic postal users, but the burgeoning international community of stamp collectors. This realization shaped their entire philatelic strategy for the next century. The Republic deliberately pursued a policy of producing stamps of high artistic quality, often featuring intricate engravings and innovative designs, in carefully limited print runs. This ensured that each issue would be relatively scarce, thus driving up its collectible value. The themes depicted on these stamps became a powerful tool of cultural diplomacy. They were miniature, state-sanctioned canvases that projected an image of the Republic to the world. The designs celebrated the key moments and figures of Sammarinese history, from St. Marinus and the Three Towers to Garibaldi and Lincoln, whom the Republic had made an honorary citizen. They showcased the Republic's commitment to peace, liberty, and its unique republican institutions. This was a form of soft power, a way of telling its story and reinforcing its legitimacy on a global scale, one envelope at a time. The revenue generated was transformative. For much of the 20th century, especially before the boom in tourism and finance, the sale of postage stamps was the single largest contributor to the state's budget, funding public works, social services, and the machinery of government. This successful model was extended to numismatics. The Republic began minting its own coins, the Sammarinese lira, again aimed primarily at the international collectors' market. The right to mint currency was another fundamental assertion of sovereignty, and like the stamps, the coins were designed with high artistic merit and produced in limited quantities. After Italy adopted the euro, San Marino, through a special agreement with the European Union, secured the right to mint its own unique Sammarinese euro coins. These, particularly the low mintage commemorative editions, are among the most sought-after and valuable euro coins for collectors. This entire enterprise, born of economic necessity, was a stroke of genius. It transformed the abstract concept of sovereignty into a tangible, high-margin export commodity, providing the economic foundation for the modern Sammarinese state. The economic model that brought San Marino prosperity in the 20th century created profound vulnerabilities in the 21st. In a globalized world defined by integrated markets and international regulatory bodies, the very characteristics that had been assets a sovereign legal system and banking secrecy became liabilities. The first and most severe challenge came from the international crackdown on so-called tax havens. In the wake of the 2008 financial crisis, organizations like the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, OECD, and the G20 launched a coordinated campaign to eliminate banking secrecy and combat tax evasion. San Marino, whose financial sector was a cornerstone of its economy, found itself placed on international blacklists and grey lists. This was not a military threat, but an existential economic one, as it threatened to cut the Republic off from the global financial system. The Republic was forced into a period of painful and fundamental reform. It had to dismantle the very system of banking secrecy that had attracted so much foreign capital. This involved signing dozens of tax information exchange agreements, TIEs, and adhering to the OECD's stringent standards for transparency. This process was a difficult internal political struggle, as it required a complete overhaul of a key economic pillar. But the alternative permanent international financial isolation was untenable. The Republic successfully transitioned to a more transparent financial model, but the process fundamentally altered its economic landscape and reduced the comparative advantage it once held. The second major challenge is the Republic's complex and asymmetric relationship with the European Union. San Marino is not a member of the EU, yet it is entirely surrounded by it, uses the euro as its currency through a special monetary agreement, and its economy is completely dependent on access to the EU's single market. This creates a significant democratic and sovereign deficit. To function, San Marino must adopt a vast body of EU legislation, the acquis communautaire, in areas like trade, customs and financial regulation. But it has no seat on the European Council, no representation in the European Parliament, and no voice in the creation of the very laws it must implement. This reality has sparked a continuous and unresolved internal debate about the future, with ongoing negotiations for a potential association agreement that would grant better market access but require even deeper legislative alignment, a modern-day version of the Republic's historical dilemma: how to cooperate with a vastly larger power without sacrificing meaningful independence. 17 centuries of sovereign existence in complete isolation have forged a distinct Sammarinese culture, a unique identity preserved against the homogenizing influence of the surrounding Italian peninsula. The most fundamental expression of this is the local dialect, Sammarinese. Linguistically, it is a variant of the Romagnol dialect group, but its prolonged isolation has allowed it to retain archaic features and develop unique vocabulary and phonetic characteristics that distinguish it from the dialects spoken on the plains below. While Standard Italian is the official language of government and education, the Sammarinese dialect remains the language of the home and the community, a living linguistic artifact of the Republic's long separation from the broader Italian cultural evolution. This cultural distinctiveness is also evident in its culinary traditions, which are a direct reflection of a historically poor, agrarian, and siege mentality economy. Sammarinese cuisine is a rustic and resourceful tradition, born from the necessity of maximizing the limited products of the mountain. It is based on simple, locally sourced ingredients: grains, legumes, pork, and cheeses. Traditional dishes like nidi di rondine, a baked pasta, or piadina, the ubiquitous local flatbread, are staples of the Romagnol region but have their own distinct local variations. The Republic is also known for its own wines, primarily the Sangiovese-based Brugnito, and its unique liqueurs like the Tylus, a truffle-based spirit. The most famous culinary creation is the Torta Tre Monti, a layered wafer cake held together by chocolate and hazelnut creams, a modern confection that has become a national symbol. The most visible and vital form of cultural preservation is the Republic's calendar of historical festivals. These are not modern inventions for the benefit of tourists, but are deeply ingrained civic rituals that connect the contemporary population to their history. The semi-annual investiture of the Captain's Regent is the central event, a state ceremony that reaffirms the Republic's political traditions. Equally important are the medieval days and the Crossbowman's Palio, which celebrate the Republic's military history and its medieval origins. During these festivals, the historic center of the city is transformed, with citizens dressing in period costume and participating in historical reenactments, flag-throwing displays, and crossbow competitions. These events are a collective act of remembrance, a way of performing history that keeps the Republic's unique identity and foundational values alive and present for each new generation. The modern landscape of San Marino is in itself a historical document. In 2008, UNESCO inscribed San Marino, Historic Center and Mount Titano on its World Heritage List, a designation of profound significance. The Republic was not recognized merely for its architectural beauty or its dramatic setting, but as an exceptional testimony of a living cultural tradition that has persisted for the last 700 years. This is the key to understanding the view from its towers today. The physical environment is the material evidence of an unbroken political and cultural continuity. The towers, walls, gates, and public buildings are not a reconstructed theme park of a medieval commune. They are the original, continuously inhabited and functioning infrastructure of a medieval commune that never ceased to exist. The physical fabric of the state is a direct reflection of its history of defensive self-reliance. The three towers, Guaita, Cesta, and Montal, are linked by a network of walls and ramparts that are not ruins but preserved elements of a military architecture that successfully deterred aggression for centuries. The historic centre, with its narrow, winding streets, stone houses, and small public squares, is a perfectly preserved example of a medieval Italian city-state, a political form that has vanished everywhere else. The Palazzo Pubblico, the neo-Gothic town hall rebuilt in the late 19th century on the site of its ancient predecessor, is not a museum. It is the active, functioning seat of the Great and General Council and the workplace of the Captain's Regent, the heart of a living government. This fusion of the ancient and the modern is the defining characteristic of the Samarinese landscape. The view from the towers is not just a panoramic vista of the surrounding Italian regions of Romagna and March. It is a view into a different political dimension. Below lies a modern nation-state formed in the 19th century, while the observer stands within a political entity whose statutes were codified in 1600 and whose executive office was created in 1243. The cultural landscape is one of deliberate preservation, where the physical environment is meticulously maintained as a testament to the Republic's unique history. The UNESCO designation is a formal international recognition of this fact, that the value of San Marino lies not just in its past, but in its persistence, a physical and political landscape that stands as a living testament to 17 centuries of uninterrupted liberty. The enduring legacy of St. Marinus is not primarily religious, but profoundly political, a set of foundational principles that have functioned as the Republic's immutable constitution for 17 centuries. The first and most critical of these is the concept of freedom, libertas. As bequeathed in his traditional testament, this was a radical declaration of dual independence from the two universal powers of the age, the Emperor and the Pope. This external liberty, however, was always intrinsically linked to an internal one, the freedom of the citizens from the tyranny of their own government. The entire political structure of the Republic, from the dual short-term captaincy to the sovereignty of the Council, was a direct and practical application of this principle. It was a system built on the fundamental assumption that power is a corrupting force that must be perpetually fragmented, shared, and held accountable. This was the core of the saint's political inheritance, a deep and abiding suspicion of concentrated authority. The second principle was that of community. Marinus did not bequeath the mountain to a single heir or a ruling class, but to the collective of his followers. This established the Republic not as a territory to be governed, but as a shared patrimony to be administered by its co-owners. This concept fostered an extraordinary sense of social cohesion and shared responsibility. The defense of the Republic was not the duty of a professional army, but of every citizen, because every citizen was defending their own inheritance. This principle explains the Republic's resilience in the face of existential threats. An attack on San Marino was an attack on every family's personal property and legacy. This sense of a common enterprise, a society of stakeholders rather than subjects, was the essential social glue that held the state together through centuries of invasion, famine, and political pressure. The third principle was peace, but a peace understood in a specific, pragmatic sense. It was not pacifism, but a doctrine of non-aggression and neutrality, backed by a credible capacity for self-defense. San Marino's history is one of studiously avoiding entanglement in the conflicts of its larger neighbors. Its military was never an instrument of conquest, but purely a tool of deterrence. This policy was a direct outgrowth of the first two principles. A free and communal society had no interest in the dynastic or territorial ambitions that drove the monarchies and empires around it. Its sole foreign policy objective was its own preservation. These three principles, a dual freedom from external and internal tyranny, a community of shared ownership, and a foreign policy of armed neutrality, form the practical and philosophical legacy of the saint. They are the simple yet profound ideas that have guided the Republic, allowing it to navigate 17 centuries of history, not as a passive relic, but as a continuous and successful political experiment. The 17th century survival of San Marino is a historical anomaly that defies conventional theories of statecraft, which equate power with size, wealth, and military might. The Republic's endurance is rooted in a profound paradox. Its greatest strengths were its most apparent weaknesses. The first of these was its diminutive size. In every era, San Marino was too small to constitute a geopolitical threat to its neighbors. It could never project power, raise a significant army, or challenge the interests of larger states. This inherent harmlessness was its primary shield. For powers like the Malatesta, the papacy, or the Kingdom of Italy, the Republic was a negligible factor in their strategic calculations. It was a political entity that could be safely ignored, and this obscurity was a more effective defense than any army. The second paradoxical strength was its strategic poverty. For most of its history, the Republic was resource poor, possessing no significant agricultural lands, mineral wealth, or major trade routes. This lack of assets was a powerful disincentive to conquest. The cost-benefit analysis for any potential invader, from a medieval condottiero to a Renaissance prince, was starkly negative. A military campaign to subdue the mountain would be costly in terms of men and material, while the prize, a small rocky territory with a subsistence economy, was virtually worthless. This strategic poverty meant that San Marino was never a prize to be won. This principle was so deeply ingrained in the state's political DNA that it led to the conscious refusal of Napoleon's offer of territorial expansion, a decision based on the astute understanding that wealth and land would make them a target. The third, and most crucial element, was its steadfast neutrality. This was not a passive stance, but an active and consistent foreign policy. By refusing to be drawn into the endless conflicts of the Italian peninsula, San Marino made itself more useful to its neighbors as a neutral and predictable entity than it would have been as a conquered vassal. It could serve as a place of refuge, a discreet channel for communication, or simply a stable point in a chaotic landscape. This reliability gave it a form of diplomatic leverage that belied its size. These three factors, its insignificant size, its lack of valuable resources, and its unwavering neutrality, created a unique political ecosystem. San Marino survived by making itself strategically irrelevant, economically unappealing, and diplomatically reliable. It outlasted the Roman Empire, the Holy Roman Empire, and countless kingdoms and duchies, not by being strong in the conventional sense, but by mastering the paradoxical art of survival through weakness. The ultimate role of San Marino in the modern world is not that of a conventional state, but of a living artifact. While other places preserve the memory of republicanism, the Roman Forum is a museum of a republic. Venice is a museum of a maritime empire. San Marino is the Republic. Its existence is not a reenactment or a preservation of historical buildings, but the uninterrupted continuation of a political life that began in the late Roman era. This makes it a unique entity, a political institution that has become its own most important historical monument. The state itself is the primary exhibit. Its daily functions a continuous demonstration of a political system that has vanished everywhere else. Its value lies not in what it once was, but in the fact that it still is. This is most evident in the functioning of its core institutions. The Great and General Council is not a modern parliament named after an ancient body. It is the direct linear successor to the council established in the 13th century, a legislative body with an unbroken institutional history. The semi-annual investiture of the Captain's Regent is not a historical pageant, but the functioning constitutional transfer of executive power, a process that has continued in the same manner, with the same principles, since 1243. This provides a tangible, observable link to the political world of the medieval Italian communes. While political scientists study the history of republican ideals from the texts of Cicero or Machiavelli, San Marino offers a living case study, a continuous historical narrative of a pre-modern republican state successfully adapting to modernity without a revolutionary break. Its historical narrative is one of persistence rather than creation. Modern nation-states like Italy or Germany were forged in the 19th century through wars of unification that deliberately erased the fragmented political entities of the past. San Marino's story is the inverse. It is the story of one of those entities that was never erased. It is not a nation-state in the modern sense, but a medieval commune that has survived into the age of nation-states. Its existence serves as a living artifact of an alternative path of political development, a testament to the fact that a state can be defined not by its power or its territorial extent, but by the resilience of its institutions and the continuity of its political ideals. It is, in effect, a living museum of liberty, where the exhibits are the functioning machinery of the state itself. The history of San Marino is, in the final analysis, the history of an idea. The enduring spirit of the mountain is not a geological or geographical phenomenon, but the persistence of a political concept across an immense span of time. What connects the modern republic to the small band of Christian refugees who first sought shelter on its peak is an unbroken chain of governance, a continuous transmission of the principle of self-determination. This is the republic's most singular and remarkable characteristic. While other states have foundational moments, revolutions, or constitutions that mark a definitive break with the past, San Marino's history is one of seamless continuity. There was no single moment of independence. It was independent from its inception. There was no revolution to establish a republic. It began as a self-governing commune and never ceased to be one. This unbroken chain is a tangible historical fact. The line of succession for the Captain's Regent can be traced back to the 13th century, and the political body that elects them, the Council, is the direct institutional descendant of the medieval Arengo. This is not a revival or a reconstruction of an ancient system. It is the ancient system, adapted and evolved, but never broken. The political DNA of the state, the core code of shared, temporary and accountable power, has been passed down through nearly 90 generations. The modern Samarinese citizen, casting a vote in a referendum or submitting a petition to the council, is participating in a political life that is directly and organically connected to that of their medieval ancestors. This continuity is the enduring whisper of the mountain. It is the quiet persistence of the original community's foundational bargain. Mutual protection in exchange for shared responsibility. Liberty in exchange for vigilance. The small band of refugees fleeing Diocletian were not intending to found a state, but in creating a community based on these principles, they established a political precedent that proved more durable than the empires that surrounded them. The modern republic, with its seat at the United Nations and its complex relationship with the European Union, is the direct and uninterrupted outcome of that first desperate ascent. The spirit of the mountain is, therefore, the spirit of its people, a continuous 17-century-long political act of memory and will. And so, the long story comes to a gentle close. It began not with armies or declarations, but with a single man seeking refuge on a limestone peak, a stonemason who laid the first unseen foundation of a state built on faith and freedom. From that solitary hermitage, a community grew, a society bound by the shared necessity of survival. As the great empires that commanded the world tore themselves apart, as Goths, Lombards, and Byzantines washed over the Italian peninsula, the small settlement on the mountain endured, protected by its altitude and its obscurity. It watched the centuries turn, a silent observer to the rise and fall of feudal dynasties, Renaissance princes, and papal armies. Its defense was not aggression, but a quiet, stubborn refusal to be absorbed, a political philosophy of contentment within its own small borders. The institutions it forged were a direct answer to the turmoil below, a council of citizens to ensure collective rule, and the steady semi-annual rhythm of its dual leadership, a system designed to immunize the state against the ambitions of a single man. It weathered the storm of Napoleon, who saw in it a reflection of his own republican ideals, and it provided shelter to the founders of a united Italy, an act of solidarity that secured its place in a new world. Through the great conflicts of the modern age, it held to its neutrality, its ancient stones providing refuge from the devastation of total war. It navigated the treacherous currents of the Cold War and found its voice in the community of nations, its sovereignty finally affirmed not by walls, but by international law. The history of this mountain is one of peace, a long and almost unbroken slumber of ages, where the great dramas of the world were events to be observed, not participated in. It is the story of a state that chose prudence over power, community over conquest, and liberty over land, a continuous thread of governance stretching from the fall of Rome to the age of the Internet, a quiet strength found in humility. And as the story ends, the mountain remains, a silent guardian of the world's oldest republic, a testament to the enduring power of an idea, cradled in stone, now drifting into the quiet of the night.